Good morning. Now, long time ago, I had a long discussion with a Canadian colleague who was of the opinion that conservation means management of change. And I was in disagreement with him because I thought that conservation means management of continuity. And I still think that management of continuity is the scope of conservation, because that is the whole point of heritage. Of course, we have to manage also change, but we have to manage a change in order to maintain the qualities of the past. Now I have to find out how to go on. This seems to be, that sounds reasonably okay. Wonderful to have modern technology. It's another part of the heritage. Now, cultural heritage results from traditional interaction between culture and economy. And I think it's interesting that today, if we are often distinguished between culture and economy as two different things. But I think they have always been together, because culture is the generating power, creative generation generating power, which is providing the reference for economy to manage this household that we are creating. We have to join these two forces. Over time, such processes have generated specific cultures expressing choices made and the resulting cultural identity in each place, as we say here in this point. So culture and economics. Culture is the generator and the product of development within the evolving framework of economy of the community. Economy refers to the system within which a community arranges its resource management over time. And management is a process based on shared objectives for coordinated activities directed at an efficient and sustainable utilization of a resource by a community. So the role of community is fundamentally important. Now, coming to this question of authenticity, I think that the most simple translation of authenticity is truthfulness. We are talking about the truth. The question of truth was debated in the 18th century, for example, by these two gentlemen, Giovanni Battista Vico, who was a Neapolitan lawyer, and then later Johann Gottfried Herder, who was a German historian. And this sort of, it's interesting that, well, Giovanni Vico said that there are different ways of reaching the truth. One is the mathematical truth, that you have to A plus B is equal to C, something like that. The second point is that you can come to the truth by observation. For example, we can say that the nature was created by God, by divinity somehow, but we can only learn from nature by observation. Third type is doing it yourself. And in fact, then you are coming to the fact. Factum means doing it yourself. And therefore, when you are talking about factual, it means that you have done it. So therefore, you know it. And cultural heritage is a product of humanity. Therefore, we know cultural product. We know the cultural heritage. The problem is that the culture is the sort of human, the life. There is Henri Bergson who has written about this élan vital, which is translated as impetus of life. And this is considered the creative force which is intrinsically carried by all forms of life. And it is aiming at diversification. So one of the results of human activity is the diversification, but it's also the same in nature. If you look at the plants and the animals, they are continuously diversifying themselves. Therefore, this process of continuation produces an endurance. It endures in the world. So you have, for example, even a human being, in each individual, we have like layers of creative input which together form your life. So your life is the result of all this creative capacity which is continuing. And Clifford Geertz is another sociologist who has been writing about culture. He is saying that this culture is a system inherited, is a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes toward life. So I think the problem is that we have to think that culture is not done out of blue. It is based on something that has happened before, and we are building up our culture. Our culture is the result of continuation. So authenticity has been discussed a lot by, for example, ancient Greek philosophers. Autos, which is the basic word in ancient Greek, means oneself. It means that I am myself, therefore I am authentic. In Latin we are talking about auctor, which is the author, somebody who is writing something, who is producing something, which is creating something. Thus, to be authentic in the case of an artifact implies being really created by an author. Material historicity of a structure can be understood as an archaeological evidence of past events. But for example, authentic language, writing or making music, leadership, business, authenticity is all over the place, and it may have different nuances in different cases. In philosophy, the philosophia means love of wisdom, love of knowledge. So you reach the knowledge by learning. Life actually is a learning process. And in fact, it is this continuity which is helping you to learn. It's interesting that in ancient Greece also it was considered that truth was a goddess. It was a spirit, divinity. And for the divinities, for divine powers, the gods, the truth was always available. But for the human beings, there is a need for an effort to come to the truth. So every time you want to come to the truth, you have to make an effort in order to unconceal your truth. So it means that it is not always necessarily obvious to everybody. Now, this question of authenticity has different nuances, shall we say. Often authenticity is referred to something which is original, because that is the original factum, original fact which has been done. Replica is not original, but then it becomes like a new original because, for example, ancient Greek statues were copied by the Roman artists. And although the Roman artists created replicas of the Greek ancient artifacts, they became like new originals in their own time. And in fact, human beings have always made through mimesis. We have, in a way, copied things, but then when it is done a second time or third time, a millionth time, it will become like a new original. For example, if you have a Madonna and Child, which is a very common theme in Christianity, and not only in Christianity, also in Buddhism, it means that you are making thousands and thousands and thousands of Madonnas of Child. Each individual Madonna of Child is a new creation. The theme is the same. Then you have this concept of inauthentic. For example, in this picture on the left you have the original statue, which has been then made as a replica in the Erechteum temple on the Acropolis in Athens. In the center there is the original, the copy of the original. So the replica on the original can be understood as inauthentic because it repeats exactly the same form as the original, but it's not the original. So it's not authentic, but it's inauthentic. And that is in a way of, we could say that in museums, sometimes you have replicas, which are in a way, if they are correctly made, faithfully producing the same characteristics, they are giving the correct type of information. They are not authentic, but they are inauthentic, but they are not fake. Now, the temple here on the right, the palace on the right, the Japanese palace in Nara, it is a reconstruction of a palace building that used to be in the ancient imperial capital of Nara. But it is made on the basis of a hypothesis. And actually it was not in this particular place, it was on a different place. Because on this particular place there was another type of palace, which was much smaller. So they decided, the authorities decided to reconstruct here a new palace, which was referred to something which was somewhere else and put in this place. It's clearly a modern building. There are seismic resistant foundations in reinforced concrete with the cushions. And it's just like an exhibition hall today. But in some way it's a fake. It's a fake because it gives the wrong information. It gives information of something that never existed here, not even as a replica. It's also, in a way, a hypothesis because it is based on some sketches in Japanese paintings. There is no, and the foundations, you have the foundations, they have existed, but the foundations are wooden poles, wooden piles. So you can see the difference in earth, where you used to have the wooden pile and where there was no wooden pile. So then you have the question of testimony. So authenticity in some way refers to something which becomes a testimony. What is interesting, and I'm putting this here, this text in French and English, because this is the preface of the beginning of the Venice Charter, where it says that, in English, imbued with a message from the past, the historic monuments of generations of people remain to the present day as living witnesses of age-old traditions. It's our duty to hand them on in the full richness of their authenticity. Which is interesting that in French we are talking a little bit differently from these same things. And they say that les œuvres monumentales des peuples, they are saying that the important achievements of the people are remaining as witnesses. So they are not talking about monuments, but monument in today's world has been given a very particular, very physical meaning. For example, it has been said that, okay, the 1972 World Heritage Convention refers to monuments, which is not quite true. And the 2003 refers to the intangible cultural heritage, which is true. But the whole concept of intangible cultural heritage and tangible cultural heritage, I think it is a simplification. And I think we should be a bit careful about it, because all human activities, all creative activities, when you are elaborating your material, you are actually associating your intangible meaning to this object. And therefore all the physical heritage has the intangible aspect, an intangible dimension to it. And in fact, the recognition of the significance of a historic object means that you are in some way making an effort to come to the understanding the authenticity and the significance of that particular object. But of course we also have to remember that one of the characteristic features of human cultures is the concept of diversity. And in fact, in the NARA document on authenticity, it says that the diversity of cultures and heritage in our world is an irreplaceable source of spiritual and intellectual richness for all humankind. All cultures and societies are rooted in the particular forms and means of tangible and intangible expression which constitute their heritage, and these should be respected. What is interesting is, in a way, that if we accept that each place has its own specificity, it is authentic in its own right, also conservation cannot be a standard operation. It means that the conservation must recognize the specificity of each place, and you have to find the right and appropriate solution to the treatment of that particular case. By the way, the picture is a tea room near Kyoto, dating from the 15th century. It's a very small room. This is the entrance door to the tea room. It is part of a temple complex now, but it still is the original, authentic tea room, which has always been in that particular position. If we look at the role of the community, I think it is necessary to think that when you are talking about the resource, which is the heritage thinking, it is produced originally to satisfy the needs of the community. So the community is there through the creative action, to develop typology and morphology of the place, of the site, making it design, details, and so on. Working in materials, technology, and creating, therefore, a tradition which endures in time. But this place is also in a particular environmental context. So you have to take into account the setting or the context, the physical environmental context, which provides you also with the materials. And then when we are thinking about it, it is the human creativity through duration that actually builds this heritage resource. And authenticity is not a static thing, but it is something which is built over time. So authenticity is not just referring to the original, but it can also refer to the later layers of this, the historical authenticity. When you are recognizing something as heritage, therefore you must take into account this whole complex. You have to understand how things have developed, how they have been, how they have endured over time, and what is the meaning of every place. And then, depending on what you find, if the traditional continuity is still there, if it is a living village, traditional village in some mountain region, then the idea would be to try to help to continue the tradition to live. But if the tradition is no more there, then you are using modern technologies to maintain the truthfulness of the place without losing this historical stratigraphy and the context. The problem often is the context. So you have to understand that a place like a historic settlement, it is like a text. It's like a texture that you can read if you understand it. So you have to understand the form and design of the place, the materials and substance, use and function, traditions, techniques, location, and so on. But especially you have to understand where it is located. What is the connection? This is Rauma in Finland. It's a World Heritage Site. Sorry, I wanted to say that above there is the little picture. I don't know, it's a bit pale, but you see that the yellow, the darker yellow is the actual World Heritage Site, and the pale brownish surrounding is the buffer zone. But then you have the white area in the left-hand corner. That is the big shopping center, shopping mall, which is being now designed. The problem is that when you have a traditional city like Rauma, which is a little wooden city, and you put a huge mall, shopping mall, next to it, what happens with the traditional functions of the city? You are you have a problem very soon. And you already have it, because now the people are already leaving the traditional shops. Instead of doing an action where the shopping mall would support the traditional functions in the city, you are actually distracting the traditional functions from the city. However, I would say that the other point is that we have been talking a lot about authenticity, but we should also remember that we first have to think about integrity. Because integrity, according to the World Heritage Operational Guidelines, means that it refers to the signs that together define a resource in its integrity, in its symbolic, social, symbolic, and functional qualities in the territory concerned. So you have to identify which are the elements that together define the significance of this function, and the social functional integrity of the place. What is the historical structural integrity? What are the layers of significance, significant layers in this? And what is the resulting visual integrity? When I talk about visual integrity, I'm not talking about aesthetics. I'm talking about the impression that is given by this particular type of evolution in this particular place within its context. So this comes out as the significance of the place. And so you have to take into account the tangible and intangible aspects, not just the tangible, but also the intangible aspects, even if we are talking about so-called monuments. And you have to recognize the cultural and historical specificity within the context. John Dewey, an American philosopher, has written that a work of art, no matter how old and classic, it's actually, and not just potentially, a work of art when it lives in some individualized experience. So it means that you have to recognize it, you have to understand the intangible aspect of a work of art. And that means that it lives in your mind, and in fact, it has been said by several writers that the conservation actually is through the recognition of works of art, understanding and appreciating the intangible quality, intangible value, intangible significance of the place. The problem is that modern works often don't necessarily always work that way, modern planning. For example, on the right you have, this is Shaki in Azerbaijan, which is a fantastic city. It has now been put on the World Heritage List. It's a traditional city which has survived within a natural context, which is itself also protected. And so it has maintained its traditional integrity within the thing. And it is within this integrity that you then can go to look at the authenticity in that context. On the left you have in Nepal, you have the birthplace of Buddha, and which is, as you see on the right, there is a circle. There is a Japanese architect who designed a new town plan. So he designed a formal circle with the crossroads and the sort of like possible development patterns also for the rest. But he did not actually consider the whole environment. So the whole environment is completely disconnected of the birthplace. And in fact, in reality, in this surroundings, you have plenty of still authentic reminders of the history of the Buddha's presence here in this region, which are still there. And of course, they are not been destroyed, but this development is proposing something which may create problems for this in the future. So when we are looking at the relationship of value and significance, I think we have to understand, first of all, we have to understand what is the meaning of a resource, what is the significance. Then if we want to understand, the value is the result of a learning process, and it is usually result of a comparison. You have, this is this compares with other similar types of sites this way and that way. This is more interesting, this is less interesting. And in fact, the whole concept of World Heritage evaluation is through comparison. So you have to have a clear understanding what is the significance of the place. Then you have to have a thematic survey to understand where you find similar sites. And then you make a comparison, and you can demonstrate that this particular site is outstanding in reference to the others. If you don't do that, if you say that this site is unique, there is no comparison, then it will not go to the World Heritage List. So there is a relationship of the intangible and tangible, which means that every place has its own intangible aspects, even dances and rituals, and which are being performed, and of course also worshipped, like here. This, for example, is in Japan, in Taketomi Island, where there is something which is called utaki. Utaki is a place in nature which is worshipped because of the spirits of nature which are represented in that particular place. And so this is still, they are modern people. They are modern, normal business persons, modern professionals, but they still worship their own utakis, and which I think is a fantastic system. But it means that you have to understand this. The traditions can live further, if you want. Anyway, in order to go back to this question of understanding the places, we need to have some capacity building. And there is the ICOMOS training committee has drafted a guideline in 1993. And then on the basis of that, there is Kotak in Britain who has also seen how this compares to different disciplines. And we can see that some of the professional architects, conservation officers, conservators, landscape architects, surveyors, curators, and so on, they must actually have a full understanding of all the different aspects of heritage conservation. Then there are many others which are various technicians, building contractors, and so on, which may have to be informed about specific aspects of conservation. But what this means that if you want to do conservation, you have to get the people involved. You have to inform the community. The community is a key aspect in this. And you have to understand what are the responsibilities of each. So the owner of the property should accept the responsibility as a trustee for future generations. The art historian should analyze and advise on the authenticity and significance of the place. And the architect should appreciate the different approaches that are appropriate to ancient monuments and so on. So you have this sort of system. But then you have to develop a training strategy for each place, where the aim is to strengthen the knowledge and abilities and skills and behavior of people, improve the institutional structures, and introduce a dynamic relationship between heritage and the context. It has to become sort of accepted as part of the modern heritage. So the World Heritage and community relationship is fundamental for maintaining the question of authenticity. As they say in the Kyoto Vision, only through strengthened relationship between people and heritage based on respect for culture and biological diversity as a whole, integrating both tangible and intangible aspects and geared towards sustainable development, will the future we want become attainable. And of course you have different details. Here, this is a community event in Kyoto where they are teaching people how to behave in terms of emergencies. Of course, then you have various specific cases like wall paintings, which need to have a very special care. There you have to have a specialist who is taking care of it. Historic buildings need to be maintained, so there you need to have properly trained workmen who are taking care. Vernacular architecture is another very problematic issue, I would say, because, but verna is the Latin word for slave, home slave, something which belongs to the place. So we have to distinguish between vernacular architecture and traditional architecture. Vernacular is something which belongs to that place and is born in that particular place. Traditional architecture can be in style of. But you have to look at the whole historicized territory. This is Røros in Norway, which is a World Heritage Site. What is interesting is originally only the wooden town was nominated to the World Heritage List. But then later, after some discussions, 20 years later, original was about 1980, then 20 years later, about 2000 plus, they decided to take into account the whole industrial cultural landscape. And so therefore now there is a very much larger area. And of course, one way of conserving is to make a museum like this Williamsburg in America. But that is not real conservation. I think this is like keeping, and here, of course, not everything is authentic. It's sort of 50-50. The important thing is to have the historic urban areas. The question is, what is the role of architects? I think when the architect is building like this friendly alien on the left into Graz in Austria, I mean, this Graz is a historic town which was inscribed in the World Heritage List on the basis, referred to the building typology traditionally maintained through centuries, and now you have this friendly alien which is not so friendly at all, but it's called the cultural center. And of course Liverpool and the above is also in danger of being delisted because they are putting these skyscrapers next door. There are lots of basic problems which are now, especially today, we have the reconstruction problem. Palmyra, for example, has the various, say, Syrian sites like Aleppo and so on are really problematic sites, and there you have to understand what happens. You have to think about the spiritus loci, the genius, which is the protective spirit of the place, which has to be maintained in order to keep its identity and therefore also its authenticity. Thank you very much.